most of us, we walk around and we imagine that the physical environment that we're in has sort of always been here. It's just sort of an a priori kind of idea. Suburbs are super new. Really, suburbs didn't come into fruition until after World War II, and they were built very much by design. Federal Highway Act, mortgage interest deduction, GI Bill, and then all sorts of other things that racialized them, like redlining. I mean, I am not saying all suburbs are racist. Let me please stipulate that. All I'm saying is that the origins of the suburban story were very much about a certain white middle class that government was designing for and our economic system was designing for. In fact, I think a lot of the anger, the again in MAGA, is about the fact that government, it wasn't that people weren't on government welfare, they were. It's just that welfare served a certain group of people, and there is a desire to go back to that.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to This Anthro Life. As always, I'm your host, Adam Gamo. Really excited to be here with you today. And we're diving into a topic that I think is both super important and really interesting for how we might think about what we can do with the future. And this is, of course, around like the lived and built environment and basically how the spaces that we build will shape what kind of society that we can be or could be, right? And so I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Vishaan Chakrabarti, who's the founder of the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, or POW, as well as the author of a really awesome new book called The Architecture of Urbanity, Designing for Culture, Nature, and Joy. And it's interesting because like a lot of the conversations that we see happening online and around folks like about cities like get stuck between these like two technical areas. One is kind of on the idea of like, do we have the right metrics and the right kind of carbon capture things that we're thinking about? And other things about that cities are either just like wastelands or like they're the problem for climate change because there's so many people, there's a lot of pollution, all these elements kind of coming together. But you approach this problem differently. And I think that's important, right? That we can actually think about design in a thoughtful way that can kind of help us solve some of these biggest challenges that we have coming, you know, from things like social isolation, climate change, to, I think, importantly, helping create more joyful and connected communities. So as an anthropologist, I like this idea and this approach. So let's kind of talk about that. Like the one of the things that really caught my attention early on in your work is this idea of like cities as an area that we can create positive social friction. And I love this idea because oftentimes we think about that friction feels like a bad word or something that we don't want. But then, you know, on the other side, I'm like, a frictionless experience might be a little bit too slippery. And we might think about that in terms of Amazon's, you know, cart from product to buying is a little bit too frictionless, and that I end up buying too many things sometimes. So somewhere in between getting the right kind of friction, especially social, seems important. So what is this kind of concept? I think it's a really important kind of anchoring piece for us to think about. What is it that cities can do for us in this kind of space of creating this positive social friction?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Adam, and it's great to be here. So the book is about, you know, what design and the built environment have to do with, I think, the pressing challenges of our time. And to me, the ones that are the most pressing are climate change and social and political division. Obviously, we just came out of a very, very tough election, very divided country. And so this idea of social frictions, I think, really timely and poignant to talk about because, you know, a frictionless world is sort of one where everyone agrees with you, right? And so a lot of social media algorithms are out there putting us in our silos with other people who agree with us. And so we experience sort of less and less friction until like the algorithm decides to like pit one of us against the other in some like anger filled, social media rage. And so I think collective physical environments, and I'm going to use that kind of wonkier term as opposed to cities, because the book is really trying to define urbanity very expansively, not just as big cities, but even small villages, even rural main streets, right? That what the space of collective environments do is they bring us together face to face. And we then have to, you know, confront people who look different than us, pray differently than us, vote differently than us. And, you know, to me, the distinction between community and urbanity is community is often the way in which people who are very like-minded find common cause together. And there's nothing wrong with that. But urbanity is this idea of being confronted and ultimately celebrating difference, right? That if you see a person in a burqa, maybe they are way less scary in person than they are as like this kind of thing to be feared online,
Mm.
right? Um, and similarly, so like a lot of our work as a firm is in the industrial Midwest, and it's literally like a lot of the cities where the red pixels and the blue pixels meet, and we
Yeah.
create a lot of public space in those cities. So I've seen people who are clearly, in one political camp and clearly in another political camp. And like, I've actually helped create space where they're dancing together. And like, that to me is really, really important in the times we live in and
Mm.
coming out of the aftermath of this election. And so, you know, I was really glad to get this invitation because, I don't think the fields outside of design, take
Mm.
anthropology, think that much about, and correct me if I'm wrong, think that much about
Yeah.
design and the built environment as something that's really influential on how people behave. But I think that there is a strong case to be made that in a world of social media, in a world of AI, in a world where technology and algorithms are actively sort of messing with our heads and doing things with our sense of solidarity as a people, that the built environment can kind of do the opposite. The built environment can provide a kind of
Mm.
societal glue in terms of, again, like, we need to rebuild rural main streets in this country. Rural main
Yeah.
streets have been decimated, and that's something we can talk about. But even in our big cities, um, we need better and more public space that feels safe and places where we can really celebrate difference, and that celebration in turn is an act of joy. And
Mm.
I think it's really important to lean into that because I think you're right. A lot of the literature around cities is either kind of technocratic
Mm.
or completely misses the environmental argument by saying, well, they're heat islands and there are lots of people and they're polluted. No, 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 no. Cities, when people especially like live in apartments and use mass transit, we have a way lower carbon footprint per person. They're actually very environmental friendly. Even a small village where people can
Mm.
just walk around more as opposed to getting in a car to get a quart of milk has substantial environmental benefits. And so there's a lot we could talk about here about what the built environment can do. And I just find that most policymakers, academics don't really pay attention to this aspect of society at all.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I think you're right that there's kind of a, it's just like a there, right? That literally it's the place in this, right, where we are, but we don't often kind of reflect on that in terms of how is our activities behavior shaped by like how are we in certain spaces, right? And it's funny because like a lot of folks might also approach this from the perspective of like, okay, if I'm beginning to think about built environment and space, like both I think about like how am I able to walk on a sidewalk. Some people might come at it from the like Jane Jacobs, neighborhood eyes on the street kind of perspective of like how can we all be in a neighborhood space together and build that. Others might come from it from a kind of, I guess, a consumer-oriented lens. We're thinking about like Howard Schultz, from the former CEO of Starbucks, idea of like third space in
Yep.
terms of like what can a coffee shop be that's not work, that's not home. But I kind of think also the important way of how you're approaching this too is that we're kind of missing things if we're just going from these two angles only. And that I love this idea that urbanity doesn't have to be in a city, right? That like it is about like when we think about productive frictions too. It is like I think you talk about that it can be in like rural villages, right? It can be in these other much smaller spaces, and so that's something that like it's important for us to take seriously. And what I appreciate that your work does too is that you approach this kind of like an anthropologist, right? You are saying how do we bring all these disparate perspectives and viewpoints of how we approach solving a problem together, because we can't solve them as silos. That's actually part of the problem, right? We keep siloing our thinking into one arena. And so in this case, like the question of housing, I think is such an important piece, right? Of like how we are able to live together, right? And it might be either the masochist in me or the I don't know, the social scientist, but I appreciated also how you walk us through in Architecture of Urbanity to think about like a lot of how did we get to some of these challenge points, right? In terms of like auto-focused car culture, the rise of suburbs, right? And like, in a lot of practices that were like redlining in terms of like doing racial segregation intentionally in cities to split out groups. And so I'm curious, like, as you think about like some of these historical trends, for folks that haven't checked out the book yet, like, walk us through, I guess, some of these of like how we have like gotten ourselves to this point of challenge in terms of like how we've been setting up cities since the 50s, really. I mean, obviously before that too.
Yeah.
Like what took place here?
And so The first half of the book is really about how we got here. And I think the
Yeah.
important thing to understand is for your listeners, especially, you said something that's really critical, which is most of us, we walk around and we imagine that the physical environment that we're in has sort of always been here. It's just sort of an a priori kind of idea,
Yeah.
right? Suburbs are super new. Really,
Mhm.
suburbs didn't come into fruition until after World War II, and they were built very much by design. Federal Highway Act, mortgage interest
Yeah.
deduction, GI Bill, and then all sorts of other things that racialize them, like redlining. I mean,
Yeah.
and people sometimes hear the wrong thing when I say that. I am not saying all suburbs are racist. Can we please stipulate
Yeah.
that? All I'm saying is that the origins of the suburban story were very much about a certain white middle class that government was designing for and our economic system was designing for. In fact, I think a lot of the anger, the again in MAGA, is about the
Yeah.
fact that government, it wasn't that people weren't on government welfare. They were.
Yeah.
It's just that that welfare served a certain group of people.
Yeah.
And there is a desire to go back to that.
Yeah.
And then, the 60s civil rights movement happens. The definition of public expands. It wasn't until 1965 until African American women had the right to vote
Yeah.
nationwide. And
It's insane.
so, yeah. I mean, that's the year I was born. I mean, I find that it's astonishing. And so, our definition of public doesn't really include everyone until the late 60s. And by that point, and so this mentality around government spending. So, a country that only 10 years earlier had passed the biggest federal infrastructure bill in the country, the National Highway and Defense Act, that built our interstate highway system. None of that was seen as government waste. None of
Yeah.
it was seen as like profligate. And by the time you move into Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs, suddenly it's all like we've got to starve the beast. It's all
Yeah.
government waste. And so the point is, no matter where you sit with that politically, the important thing to understand is that the physical environment we have today was a consequence of policy and a consequence of design. And
Yeah.
there have been lots of failures in terms of that. We created basically with suburban living the most carbon intensive, racially, socially, and economically segregated form of human habitation in the history of our species.
Yeah.
And, um, we actually have this idea that it's about the American dream. That's not true. The American dream was defined in the 1930s.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with houses and cars. It had to do with
Yeah.
equal opportunity. And so, what could a new version of the American dream look like? And this is actually important internationally because that old version of a house and a car, two cars, a lawn, set up a definition of success not just for Americans, but for people around the world. And so, like,
Yeah.
2 billion people entered the middle class around the world since the 1990s. Russia, China, India, Brazil, Turkey. Those people, many of them emulated the suburban life as their kind of definition of success. And so the planet is really straining under the resource demands of that. You know,
Yeah.
um, David Wallace Wells talks about the fact that we associate climate change and greenhouse gases with the Industrial Revolution. Most of the most pernicious stuff has happened since the first episode of Seinfeld aired. And he talks about this, right? That like really,
Mhm.
this is a pretty recent phenomena in terms of how intensively we started using resources, mainly driven by expanding houses and expanding cars. But the other thing we did is we made all that stuff really unaffordable. We
Yeah.
locked in a certain set of benefits for people my age, right? And
Yeah.
basically made it exclusionary to generations that are younger than me. And so everywhere we wrote this article, my firm Pow wrote this article in the New York Times about how to create more housing across New York City. And it was extraordinary, the global response to that article. And what I basically discovered is that there's an affordability crisis of housing everywhere, like in almost everywhere in the world, in almost every size community in America, from small towns to villages, all the way up to the big cities.
Yeah.
And so to me, the important aspect of being able to say we design for one kind of uh, uh, settlement pattern, it means we can design for another,
Mhm.
right? And so it means we can design for another, right? And so if people want to live in multifamily housing, they want more walkable environment, progressives say so, but there's data, right? Like, so you can, the most walkable environments in the country are the most popular, and they're increasingly the most expensive, because that's where
Mhm.
people want to live. It's just more convenient. That's true of red states. It's true of blue states. Um, so how do we produce more of that? How do we make it more affordable? Because we know it's more ecological, and
Mhm.
I believe it's more joyful. Um, there's a great book called The Good Life that talks about, human health and longevity, and basically says that if you control for a bunch of variables, that what really leads to human health and longevity is the strength of one's social connections, right?
Mhm.
Which leads me as an architect to think about, well, what are the kinds of environments that create social connection? And so,
Mhm.
like towards the end of the book, I talk about housing and housing prototypes that could build more neighborliness, basically build more of a sense of community, again, amongst different people, but that's much more affordable and in a way that, again, I think would be joyful, and just turn down the political heat that we seem to be experiencing right now, because everyone, regardless of your political camp, are feeling the stresses and strains of this, right?
Mhm.
And so I think we're at a really good moment to reconsider how we've been living, what our definition of success is, whether we need to kind of retool the American dream,
Mhm.
so that it is more inclusive and more environmentally friendly, less segregated, and more joyful. I think that's an interesting conversation to have, and I don't think it's a particularly partisan conversation. I think it's something that most everyone wants to get involved with at some level.
Mm. Yeah, I agree. I think that, and I think it's that's I think part of the power of this approach is that we often get caught either in an abstract conversation and or as a like a boogeyman thing that we're trying to like, or a straw man we're trying to fight against. Typically, when it comes to political division, but then we think about both what do we share, and that can literally be the shared environment, but then also what is it that we are having trouble sharing, and how is that related to our built environment too? Because it's like this interesting piece that when we think about like what is like a public space that can actually help foster kind of cultural interaction, like interaction with nature, interaction that's joyful with folks. Oftentimes we might think of like a park, right? So we all kind of like congregate
Mhm.
in a space together. But I'm kind of curious, like as we think about that, because like that's like a super baseline example, right? And so actually, I'm glad you brought up that kind of housing example too, because the kind of the Goldilocks size of density that you kind of talk about towards the end of the book too, I think is a really compelling way to have us kind of think about one, like I totally agree. I think it's an important point for us to recognize like that another world is possible because we built this one, and it doesn't mean just because we built this one that's it, right? And as we kind of think through that, when it comes to things like housing and dwelling as something that like both is should be afforded to everybody as a right. Then on top of that, like to live with dignity, I think is like another key piece here that I've also seen you write about, and that it's important for us to kind of think. We kind of talk about both the home as that kind of place, and like there's two angles that are kind of percolating in my head here, and like the one is the kind of public spaces that we share, like parks, sidewalks, maybe a shopping plaza kind of area, and the other one, of course, is like the dwelling, like the home, and um, how we've set these both up. Like one, you're kind of pointing towards here too, that like the suburbs is one of those places that like having like the automobile focus and like in the single family home are like this radically new experiment in the human story, right? That we've like decided we've not had the suburbs for a long time, right? And so that's like been a built-in fracturing of how we live together or separately. Then on top of that, like how are we thinking about public space in terms of who has access to it, and that's also comes especially to our affordable housing kind of crisis question too. So as you're thinking about this, and like and maybe we can talk about the kind of the research you did around the how do we like build the homes for a million new New Yorkers. As we think about that, like you kind of bring up this idea of the Goldilocks dimensions of a building, right? Because we kind of think, oh, if I need to have like either affordable housing or new housing, it's like immediately people tend to think of, and I did at first too, before I was looking at your work, like, a 75-story building, not that tall, but just like, like a 15-story building. And like, you have this kind of incorrect idea of like what the size actually has to be. And like this Goldilocks, dimensions you kind of talk about, like is 3 stories. That's not at all crazy to think about,
Yeah. So, I mean, look, 15 stories might be absolutely appropriate in downtown Boston or, New York or Philadelphia or San Francisco. Most of the country is a much lower scale, and we need to be super sensitive to that. The 3-story thing, really, it's a consequence of the building code. Basically, the building code says you can build a 3-story building without an elevator as long as the ground floor units are accessible to a wheelchair. And so as soon as you have so it's a step function. As soon as you have 4 stories, you need an elevator, and that changes everything. Because as soon as you need 1 elevator, you need 2 elevators, and then you need fire stairs, and then you're pouring a bunch of concrete. And then the only way the developer can like even break even is building a 15-story building. And so that's why that Goldilocks module, and the Goldilocks reference is something between a single family house and a tower, basically, right? So it's the sweet spot in between. And the beauty of that, and the reason it's important for this idea of social connection, positive social friction, is you're right, a park is one example of all of that. But the reason this housing lends itself to that is really 2 things. One is, if you basically just got a single stair that connects all the apartments in a building, it means people run into each other on that stair. If there's an elderly neighbor that you haven't seen for a while, you get worried. There's something about it that's much less anonymous. And, we used to, there's a picture in the book of like these really beautiful forms of density we built all over the world, Rome, Tel Aviv, Mumbai, which was basically, like 20 apartment units wrapped around a staircase and 1 single elevator that was in all of that's illegal today because of fire code and wheelchair code and for legitimate reasons. But we regulated ourselves out of some really beautiful, basically most of Europe is built with that kind of density, and most of it's illegal today in terms of building code, which is why everything has to revert to skyscrapers when it gets bigger. So this 3-story thing does build community just by having that single stair. The other thing about it is it's a building block, and it's really a prototype, it's not a design, but it's a building block that allows you to organize streets or courtyards or other forms of sort of semi-public space, which all of our great cities have, right? Which is like, you come off a big street, then you're on a small street, maybe you walk through a little courtyard or a muse to get to an apartment. And that hierarchy of public space is very important to people's sense of their community, their neighborhood, what scale they relate to, who they run into at the grocery store, the dry cleaner. All of that stuff really matters. It makes people feel connected. We have a loneliness crisis in the country right now. And, and I just want to, we can talk about the suburbs, but to me, the suburbs that are close into cities, right? The Lexington, Massachusetts, and the Montclair, New Jersey, and all those places are fine, and like some of them have some mass transit access. And what worries me much more, like I just finished my 6th cross-country trip, and like again, I go back to this election and how disconnected I feel people are on the coast, whether they live in the cities or the suburbs, from what's happened in rural America, and why there is the level of anger at both parties. We've decimated rural America, right? Through policy, through design, and so like most of rural America had main streets. And those main streets were where older people saw each other, where teenagers flirted, all of that kind of stuff. The main streets then got replaced by shopping malls, through the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. So the main streets, all the stores became vacant, right? And so everyone hung out at the shopping mall. But at least there was some kind of societal space in the shopping mall. But then big box e-commerce came along and said, oh, we don't have to build all of that social space that's in a shopping mall. We can just have a big box store and a bunch of asphalt, right?
Yeah.
And so when you go through all of that, what you notice is there is now no social fabric anymore. There's no social glue that's pulling people together. I mean, I'm sure people can still go to church or go to a dance or something, but that's a destination. It's not just a place where people hang out. We did this project in Columbus, Indiana, which is just a canopy over an intersection, but it was an invitation for people to use that canopy to close the street to cars and do festivals there. And there have been all sorts of very different ethnic events, you know, Pride Week and Mike Pence's Indiana, all of this stuff that's
Yeah.
happened there just by virtue of trying to create an invitation of some public space of a space that's normally used by a car. Um, and so, you know, this is one of my main takeaways from going cross country, that we've ripped away all the physical places. There are no parks per se, right?
Yeah.
Sure, some of the bigger cities across the country have parks, but just a regular small town, you're gonna be hard pressed to find a park, a playground, in some cases even a sidewalk, right?
Man.
And so what you're then doing is you're relegating people to their basements and glowing screens where they find community. And that, of course, is algorithm driven and the most divisive form of finding community. And so I think that, like, this is now, look, obviously I wish the other person had won because she was talking about 3 million new housing units. And I think there would have been a really interesting conversation about what kind of housing and for whom, and could it form more community fabric. I'm still hopeful that even the things that are flowing out of Biden's infrastructure bill will, provide some powder for us to go out and build some of the kind of societal fabric I'm talking about. But that to me is the physical challenge that's in front of us that would, over time, help to heal some of the rifts that we're feeling in our country, because there's just no place to go to be together.
Yeah. No, and that's like it's a stark reminder, right? That we have to understand where we're looking, for one, right? And kind of see, like, where are these stories. I recently was speaking with Brian Reisinger on the podcast, and he's a fourth generation Wisconsin farmer, and just wrote a book about, like, basically his family's story over the past 100 years, and, like, basically this, to your exact point, the ultimate decimation of kind of like rural America, and how that has on one hand led to, like, this deep anger at like both political parties, right? Again, it's not just a one-off or like one party kind of anger, but recognizing this is a really important point too, of, like, as the physical space of towns have changed, right? And that oftentimes if you're in a rural community, you're more spread out, but then where do you come together, right? For these kind of, get-togethers. And that's an interesting piece I hadn't really thought about in terms of, like, a church as a destination space versus necessarily just like you might just happen to be there, right? Because it's more of a timed event kind of thing. I mean, it can be a general public space too, of course, but, like, that's an important thing for us to recognize too, of, like, even if we say, well, there's this area people can get together, it's like, but what kind of character does it have in terms of, like, how are we getting these together?
Well,
right? And
again,
when?
this is the distinction in my mind between community and urbanity. If it's a destination space, if it's a church, it's people who pray together, and that's great, but it's not gonna bring people of different faiths together,
Right,
for the most part, right?
Yep.
It's so, like a Mason's Lodge, whatever it is, those are people who are finding common cause, and they, great. But the thing is, what real public space does is it creates places of serendipity, places where you're going to run into people that you didn't plan to run into, and see people you didn't plan to see. And again, especially, like, the country is much more diverse than people think, you know? And so, like, take this Springfield, Ohio thing, right? Like, like, the real story is they're legal migrants. People wanted them there because they needed workers. Now, how do you create spaces that people can interact so that community understanding can take place between, the population that's there and newcomers, right? And that I think is a really American story, right?
Yeah.
Like this is kind of like the foundations of this country, that we don't just hang out together in tribes, right?
Yeah.
But that we actually are a big polyglot nation. And so, and I really believe in that. Look, I grew up outside of Boston and experienced a tremendous amount of racism, and I've experienced a lot of that kind of stuff on both coasts. And yet, in my six cross country drives, have experienced a lot less of it.
Yeah.
You know, the country is an amazing place, and even though people may harbor whatever views they harbor, when you're face to face, and this is the whole thing about this positive social friction idea, you know, people
Yeah.
can be so repugnant online, but when people are face to face, it's a different interaction. And I would argue that good social inhibition steps in.
Mhm.
And because it steps in, it's you know, there is organically some sense of like, you know, I was I was in uh, a pretty rural town in Utah, and there was a place called New York Pizza. I had a slice of pizza in there, and I said, you know, I got to tell you, the pizza's really good, and I'm from New York City. And so, you know, I'm talking to the woman behind the counter who has never been to New York City, I assure you. And like that stuff is really important. That's what gives you some definition or idea that you actually share this idea of America, this idea of a country, right?
Yeah.
And so um, I just think that there's a lot of work to do here. You know, that like there's just so many different, you know, we won this competition to expand the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland.
Yeah.
And um, rock and roll is kind of like, you know, there's only a few bipartisan things left in the country. You know, it's sort of like pizza,
Yeah.
rock and roll, and maybe NASA, right? Like there's like, but like, you know, so this again is a space of social interaction, and we were able to create this kind of jam space, this lobby that people could come to without having to pay for a ticket, and
Yeah.
can hang out in. Young people can hang out in, make music together. And again, you'd get a lot of walks of life through that space. And so I
Yeah.
think there's just example after example that you can look to where we could create this very positive sense of urbanity, even in very small places.
Yeah.
That's a great point. And so part of it too, it makes me think is like, how are we thinking about the built environment spaces, and like we can take something as, you know, quote unquote small, right, or like individual as a home, and thinking about how we're building that in terms of multifamily housing, or you know, a bigger example that can either be, you know, train station, thinking of like Pennsylvania Station. I was thinking of that work that y'all have done on planning in that space, and also then like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a good example too of like there's a paid way to go into the building, but then also like you also have a public space kind of in the entry area too to hang out and have that kind of serendipitous space. And so I guess as we think about that too, it's like I love this idea of kind of intentionally designing for serendipity, right? Like having these kind of chance encounters with folks that you may have not planned to see, but then that's like where like the magic kind of happens, you know. And it's like I'm also thinking about this from, you know, like the I guess the other weirder example of like Burning Man, that's like designed around serendipitous occasions and just, you know, wacky coming together. Like it's got its own class issues, right? But like, you know, so how do we think about that? Like in terms of if like, what does it mean to kind of design for serendipity if we're kind of thinking about this in a space?
Well, so you mentioned Penn Station, and for your listeners who don't know Penn Station, it's the most horrible place in the United States. It's you know, it's this underground train station. It's the busiest transportation hub in the Western Hemisphere.
Very confusing.
Right. Well, it's designed for 120,000 people a day. It handles about 600,000.
Wow.
And so it's incredibly congested. There was a beautiful old station there that had been torn down years ago, triggered the nation's landmarks laws. And now we're left with this mess. And a number of us have been trying to fix the mess. But I compare it to Grand Central Station, right? Not very far away, glorious, right? And this is the way I'm going to try to answer your question about how you design for these things. You can look at so train stations, right? Like, so it's supposed to be functional. So Penn Station was designed to be this functional thing. You get off the subway, you race to your commuter train, and like if you look at the people at Penn Station, they all look miserable. They're all staring down at the floor. They're not looking at each other eye to eye. There is no real serendipity because you're just like bumping and grinding your way through the thing. Grand Central is a ballet. When you look at Grand Central, and there's hundreds of thousands of people moving there through there too, but there's big lofty ceilings, there's natural light coming in, there's almost no signage because the architecture tells you where to go. You don't need the signs. But to me, what I'm always amazed by is I walk through Grand Central Station all the time, and there are always tourists taking pictures from different vantage points. And, you know, they're observing the ballet. Like there's people taking video, and there's this way in which everyone's moving around each other and not bumping and grinding into each other like Penn Station. And what that does is it gives everyone the room to kind of exhale. And so you can look up. And when you look up, again, you see people who think differently than you. And I know people might think, oh, New Yorkers, like everyone's the same. That's not true at all. I mean, not just in terms of like racial or social diversity, but also political diversity. You know, if you look at the numbers that came out of this last election, you know, it was much closer than people think. And so, you know, to me, the contrast between the two stations kind of tells you all that you need to know about like what makes for good public space and what makes for terrible public space. And, you know, the distinction between those two things in terms of cost is so de minimis compared to the uplift, the sense of positive experience that you get. And again, same thing in small towns where you can have a bus station, you can have a park, you can have just a main street, and just a little bit of care of that says that there's this idea that we care about ourselves, that we have a sense of society, and that therefore we can get along and can bridge our differences. And I'm just, you know, it may sound all very naive, but we're at a cultural moment in this country where we have to kind of go back to ground zero and say, hang on a second, what is this country about? I mean, to me, the one piece of good news that came out of this election was that it was not close. And that meant that those who lost have to kind of look in the mirror and have to kind of understand that this is the country that they live in, and that there needs to be some sense of humility about what we missed. I'm going to say we, because I'm just going to include myself in that, right? And to me, a very good starting point is, how do we come together with people who think so fundamentally differently than us and find common cause? And I think you need a platform for that. I think you need space for that. I don't think social media is going to do it.
Yeah, I 100% would agree with that too. And that we've been algorithmically driven, you know, or duped, or whatever we want to say verb wise, of just like, what is it that we're paying attention to, right? Or I guess we're serotonergic. What's the word? Serotonergic? I don't know. You know, our brains are saying, hey, this is a good dopamine hit. I want to like.
I'm not smart enough to know that word.
I don't either. So someone knows that word. But you know, getting dopamine hit from like wanting to look at our phones, but realizing that like that's actually a huge fuel of our kind of isolation crisis, right? That we looking down versus up, and like it's amazing. It's a great contrast of like Penn Station and Grand Central Station to realize like, how are we actually physically being in a space, and like does it inspire us to look up, or like, you know, I want to take pictures of either like the kind of vaulted ceilings, and or it's just like watching how it's like the flow is happening, right? And there's something that's like really alluring of that too, but just seeing that kind of human flow piece. This makes me think too that like one of the other contrasts I really think that's important, and that also I like that you explore, is the idea of like, one of the challenges, and something that like you put words to the thing that I just seen before, I hadn't thought too much about, but that like a lot of downtowns just looks the same across the world, right? There's like a very similar skyscraper architecture that you can just envision, say, oh, that's what a downtown looks like. And as we think about like being intentional about our built environment, how it shapes how we interact with one another. There's this interesting piece of like keeping like local cultural flair, but then also kind of putting, you know, what are great standards that we can use across different places, you know, in spaces and kind of globally. And so like, how do we kind of think about that idea of like keeping the kind of local cultural flavor of, you know, buildings and spaces, but then also like letting us kind of think about different scales of buildings. So it's like, we don't have just kind of the similar or same exact kind of downtown construction, but recognize that like if we're trying to build a certain space, that we can have things that we know work, I guess, like whether it's using indigenous materials or it's, you know, kind of being intentional about if it's a bigger building, I suppose. You know, so I don't know, I'm kind of back and forth trying to think about this idea of like, what does it mean to do that? Like, how do we keep like efficiency requirements and safety regulations in place, as well as keeping like local culture as part of our
So
building
the
process?
book talks a great deal about this. I mean, I think we need to sort of so really, since the advent of commercial air travel, and then accelerated by uh, global technological services, communications, and so forth, you know, we obviously went through this period of mass globalization. That included the ability to mass produce all sorts of building materials. And so, and actually the globalization of the real estate industry. And so you still have a lot of big firms that are international firms now that build with a lot of the same materials, to the point where, you know, our built environment is indistinguishable, you know, and I hear this all the time. I'm a very pro growth, pro city person, but it's hard to be pro urban growth if the urban growth is so soul crushing. You know,
Yeah.
if the stuff all looks the same, it's got the same chain store at the bottom of it. It just, you know, and you don't even know where you are anymore. Um, I would argue that we've been experiencing for a while now, but with the pandemic, and now you got a president who's talking about tariffs, like we're we're moving to. I mean, I don't think globalization is going to completely stop, but we're transforming what it
Yeah.
was to be. You know, like NAFTA, all of that stuff was a different period of globalization, and I think part of that is coming from a real yearning people have to make sure that local histories and narratives and cultures aren't somehow bulldozed by this universalist kind of mentality that tries to make everything the same. And architecture is both a mirror and a window into what's going on in society, right? And so it both represents kind of that banal globalization. It's also kind of, I think, a window into uh, the potential for a different future. And so, like our Domino project in Brooklyn, you know, is very much about being rooted in local history and culture and heritage, and also looking forward to a kind of different reality in a different time. And I think that duality of having that both and kind of liminal condition of being able to say you can be both of the larger world, but you have to pull people with you, alongside you, in terms of history and narrative and culture. And I think this is really endemic to our species. I think it's something that's really important to us. Um, and so what I and the book talks about this a lot. What I've just sensed a great deal of in that globalizing of cities is this kind of ennui, this tremendous sense of loss, right? Where people just feel like their environments are getting bulldozed in favor of something that like is kind of unrecognizable and kind of banal and awful. And it just doesn't have to be that way. And so that's meant to be a clarion call to my industry, not just the architects, but the real estate developers and the just all the people who are responsible for this, the government officials, to just care more about the environments in which they're building, to build things that are just more materially sensitive. You know, so like in our firm, we have a whole set of criteria that we put any design through to say, you know, is this design connective for people connected to this place? You know, if you can pick up the building and move it somewhere else and it still makes sense, we've failed,
Yeah.
right?
Interesting.
And so, and this is a hard challenge, but it's a good one. And so we do a lot of this. At Princeton, we're building a building, and it's very contemporary, but we're building it out of materials that will absolutely resonate with the historic fabric of the campus. There are ways of doing this, right? It just requires attention and intention, and so look, this isn't going to solve the world's problems, but I think people feeling more connected to their culture and their climate and their just general environment, I think, again, lowers the amount of political tension, political resentment.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it's an important piece. That, like, again, I love the idea of saying, how do we both provide and bring attention and intention to the building spaces. And I wanted to, like, I don't know if I ran past it too fast, but I want to provide a little space to, like, get a sense from you, like, from your 6 cross country trips, like, how, I guess, what do you think that the left missed, I guess, or like what are they not seeing that, like, that like, I think, and I will say, like, that being there, like, showed you, like, that they can show any of us, like, if you spend time in a place with it, like, I think intention, like, what did you see that's, like, kind of caught your attention of, like, what should we be thinking about for the world that we want to build?
So my son and I pull an Airstream,
Cool.
and so we're in, sometimes we're in national parks, sometimes we're in trailer parks. And when you're in the trailer parks and you're going through, especially the industrial Midwest, which I've heard is politically kind of important, you really see a lot of pain and desperation, right? And so for the people out there who somehow think that this election was just only driven by racism or misogyny, I think they're just missing something enormous about their fellow citizens. There are many counties that voted for Barack Obama twice that went for Trump. And so it's just too easy an explanation, I find. Sure, is some of that fueling some of the anger out there? Of course. But I just think it's not the lion's share of it. I think what the left missed is the extent to which inflation, and let's not forget, hyperinflation is what elected Adolf Hitler. I mean, inflation is an insidious thing, particularly for the working class living paycheck to paycheck. But I think there's a larger thing that is about this globalization thing. And unfortunately, as an immigrant, I feel this, like immigration is too much of the channel for this anger. But this started again with both parties. So in the 90s, you had NAFTA, right? Which basically did outsource a lot of jobs. Then in the 2000s, you had the wars and you had the subprime mortgage crisis. And what I don't think we at all feel on the coast is the disproportionate impact those things had on the middle of the country. It's their sons and daughters that went off to war. It's, New York City at the depths of the subprime real estate crisis lost about 25% of its real estate value, which bounced back inside of 8 or 10 months. Whereas people lost their homes. They live in trailer parks because they lost their homes. The trauma of that doesn't go away in a year or 2 years or 4 years. So the remaking of the GOP by this man has to do with the fact that George W. Bush's GOP failed the middle of the country in ways that are just massive and still unaccounted for. And then, of course, people didn't feel like the people who created that crisis paid anything for their misdeeds, right? And so the system does feel rigged to people. And then there's one other piece I'd just like to say that's very true of both coasts, which is there's a huge private equity apparatus that went in and then picked the meat off the bones of the carcass. So the last pharmacy, the last family-owned store got, consolidated into big box and chain stores and e-commerce and just decimated the landscape. And so, there were earlier times when I took my son through some of these towns and he'd say things like it just looked like some sort of bomb had gone off. And this isn't the richest country in the world. People who are very well aware when they watch Seinfeld and Friends and Sex and the City that there's this whole other life going on in their country that they have no part in.
Yeah.
And I think that we have really lost touch with that. And so, and then gotten, involved in a lot of, these people are not focused on what pronouns to call people. And so it's just, it's important to stand up for equity and lack of bigotry and be a party of progress, but at the same time it has to include everyone. And that's I think what we missed. I think we fundamentally missed how much pain people were in, how desperate they are for change, and the fact that anyone who reeks of establishment is going to be painted with that brush, right? I think that's what we missed.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I think it's important kind of both, because at the same time too, it's like we want to encourage people not to just like just to point fingers like, oh, it's this or that, right? Because I think as you wonderfully said too, that like there's a lot of nuance there that we have to recognize, right? And that like it's not about painting broad strokes of one group or one story. Like we understand there are elements of that in there, but it's like pain and trauma are real.
To go back to the topic at hand, the places that I saw that were more physically coherent were more socially coherent. There was less distress in those places. The places that still had an intact Main Street or intact downtown, right? Because again, there's just this sense of togetherness and social bond and looking out for each other, as opposed to those towns that were just kind of decimated.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point too. Is there like a way to help, or I guess also because when you think of urban design, urban, if we think of design and architecture, like we tend to then jump to the urban, right? Like the actual city space, but it's like, how can we help kind of like bring more design movement to rural spaces too, right? Or urbanity, right? The kind of the in between, like how do we do that?
Well, we try to do it a lot. We're trying to work in as many of those kinds of places as we can find where people, people are, I gotta say, people are just astonished when you show up. They think of themselves as flyover country. They think that like we're all just out to ignore them. And so showing up is half the battle.
Yeah.
And not just to canvass for elections, but to really be there in some sort of in some sense of solidarity, right? And look, the fact is these places need investment, right? They need jobs back. I do think that a lot of the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, the things that flowed out of the Biden-Harris administration are going to do a lot of good things in the kind of communities that we're discussing, including rebuilding social fabric through infrastructure. I don't think the Biden-Harris administration is going to end up getting a lot of credit for that stuff, but I do think that is going to be helpful. But a lot of it beyond money and resources and public policy is just attention of just feeling like, we're all in this together. And, again, a lot of the work we do is trying to do that. It's just, a lot of my peers are off, designing crazy spaceships in Saudi Arabia. I have zero interest in that. There's a lot of work to do here, right? And I think all of us in different disciplines can really think about that. Like, it is a privilege to be somewhat successful in this country. My parents came here with $32. And so, I think one way of paying it forward is to just pay attention to a lot of the places. And by the way, not all of these places are in the industrial Midwest. Some of them are in a town, 2 towns over from you.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's also very important to think about. And so I'm kind of cautiously optimistic that maybe we just got a big wake up call and we need to now pay attention.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place for us to then say, let's put our attention there. Cause I think that's what is needed. And I think honestly, it's like, as we like dial it in, it's like, that's what a lot of people want to. They want to both be seen, to be heard, and to hear others, right? To like, that is that sense of connection that we can get. And recognizing that, like, in part it might be that's a few hundred miles away. Other ways it might just be, it's just down the road, right? It's a town or two over. So I think that's really great. So I appreciate you sharing that. And so I just want to say, Vishaan, thank you for joining me on the podcast today. It's been actually really fun
Sure.
to talk with you. And I appreciate you sharing your insights, and excited to get the book into the hands of listeners. So, yeah, I mean, keep doing the great work. I mean, as always, I'd love to keep the conversation going in the future, because it's important to kind of broaden these pieces. And I appreciate how you connect a lot of the different elements together, and then we can begin from one discipline, but we have to kind of see.
Yeah.
Social problems require social fabric, and fabric is sewn together, right?
Right.
We can't just say it's this one approach.
And
So
it's
I
very
appreciate your
interdisciplinary,
overview.
right?
Right on.
All right.
Cool. Well, thank you again for joining me, and it's a pleasure.
Great. Thanks very much.
All right. Cheers.